We see very, very many more women now going into the streets very easily, having coffee together, not wearing the veil. So that protest in a way has dissipated because in a way that battle has been won by women,
That
despite what the hardliners are saying.
is Iran softening its stance on making women wear the veil. Until now, the Islamic Republic of Iran stood firm on its rule that women must remain with hair covered at all times in public. It said the veil, introduced in the 1979 revolution, must be worn, but cracks are beginning to be seen. For example, one woman made a statement at a pro-government rally dressed without it on state television, dressed actually in a pink top and acid-washed jeans. 5 years ago, that footage would have been evidence for a prosecution. Uncovered hair has become an act of clear dissent in Iran, but it seems rather than make it a hill to die on, the regime now allows it on television and calls it patriotism. And that even as many religious leaders continue to demand severe punishment for women flouting the letter of the modesty laws. It feels like a contradiction within Iran. What does it tell us? Well, Dr Roxane Farmanfarmaian is the Director of International Studies and Global Politics at the University of Cambridge. Welcome to Times at One, Dr Farmanfarmaian. Let me ask you whether you see a growing contradiction here, and what do you think it means?
Well, I do think that over time since the Women Life protests took place with Masa Amini, there have been a significant change in the way that women feel they can wear the clothes they want to in Iran without suffering overdue stress about it. And the regime, I think, has tried a number of approaches to this. They realize in a way that this is a losing battle and that they need to loosen up if they're going to keep their people on side, particularly in a situation where the economy is in dire shape. And of course, right now they are in a war. There was a law passed in 2024 that was called the Hijab law that reflected the hardline view that women should remain veiled and that women who were not veiled were described as nude. However, that was put on hold by the National Security Council and has not actually been practiced, even though it was passed in 2024. So that's why we're seeing these amazing pictures of women wearing bright pink, and they're very form-fitting, and they have not worn their veils consistently for at least the last 2 or 3 years.
You talk about 2 or 3 years. I just wonder whether there's a great significance to the fact that as of late February and Donald Trump's war on Iran, that the regime, and of course they lost so many senior figures during that war, but the regime now has to prioritize the military effort, the resistance effort to keep Iran resisting the American military operation. And therefore, they've decided to be much less rigorous in imposing, what used to be the sort of morality police going around and beating up and arresting women for failing to meet the requirements on so-called modesty. Is the war part of this story?
The war certainly has added to it because it's been very important for the government to rally its people around the flag, and they have done that in the face of attacks from abroad. So I think that has definitely reflected on the women that are involved in this process. However, as I mentioned, it has been something that has anticipated the current situation by some time. And I think that's also important to understand that the hardliners, who are often the ones pushing for a reveiling, if you will, are a very loud but a relatively small group of people within the political framework. They are the ones that increasingly feel as though they don't want to negotiate. There is no feeling on their part that they want to loosen the pressure on the people economically, and by doing so are in a way anticipating a very intense regime. But it's interesting that in the military, for example, the very ones that are protecting the country and going forward in this war, the hijab is no longer a requirement. And that's a key difference that has taken place since the war.
Tell me about the woman life freedom movement. You talked about the death in custody of Mahsa Amini and the enormous and strong protest movement that came from that, led by women, and this slogan, Women, Life, Freedom. Has that been effectively crushed? We saw the terrible repression of the street protests of late 2025 and early 2026. Is woman life freedom as a movement finished?
I would say that one of the important things to understand about Iran is that protests in general are cyclical, so that the government will come down very hard on the protests, and they will, in a sense, morph. And within a year or 2 years, or slightly more, they will be back, often with different particular triggers, but it's very much the same people wanting a change, wanting more rights. And so I think the Women Life Freedom was a particularly interesting protest because it was reflecting the symbolic representation that women have in Islam, which the government has, or the regime, if you will, have often used as a symbol of their divine practice. But the women themselves have said, well, no, we would like to have a lot more freedom. And they have demonstrated ever since the revolution itself. The very first major demonstration that took place after the revolution in 1979 were the women saying, we don't want to veil. So I think we see that there is no such idea in a way of total crushing. What we see is reanimation of similar drivers. And so, no, I see that the very act that women have of going to cafes, of driving without their veils, of being in public spaces. And in Iran, the veil was always interpreted in very edgy ways. Of all the different places in the Middle East, it was always Iran that had the colorful scarves, that had the scarves way down the back of the head, loosely tied, sort of used as simply a scarf around the shoulders. And we see very, very many more women now going into the streets very easily, having coffee together, not wearing the veil. So that protest, in a way, has dissipated because, in a way, that battle has been won by women, despite what the hardliners are saying.
That is very interesting. And just as a final thought, I wonder where you think the civil popular protest movement might go next. You talk of it constantly morphing. And if woman life freedom is no longer the focus, what will the next focus be, do you think? Because there's no doubt there is so much for Iranians to be upset about, discontented with, not least the dire state of the economy as this set of hostilities with the US continues.
I think it's quite difficult to tell where it's going to go immediately because it is a country in war, and the government in many ways is making an effort to rally the people around the cause that it is the one institution that can protect the country and keep it territorially intact, and that it is being attacked from abroad. So as long as we have a pretty active war, and one where there is, a number of major battleships hanging off the coast of Iran, where there is the whole issue of the Strait of Hormuz, and that is constantly risking people's lives in the south, where there's been a great deal of bombardment. I think at the moment we see that there are less protests, but if there is no question where the protests are going to go is in the economics field, and that is a whole area that has to be resolved if and when this particular war comes to an end and negotiations have taken place.
All right. Well, we have to end there. But Dr. Roxane Farmanfarmaian, Director of International Studies and Global Politics at Cambridge University, thanks so much for joining us on The Times at 1.